Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gupta. I want to thank the Carey School of Business and the Finance Club for making my appearance here tonight possible. I really was, obviously two very prestigious organizations, but also I was promised that after my remarks, if I got out alive, I would get a free dinner. And not quite the same as a free lunch, but in these hard times, you take what you can. I've been asked to make some observations about the economy. And by the way, I had some back surgery, a couple of herniated discs. I was going to say, I just want to show you I'm feeling the pain of what the economy is going through, especially the last month in the financial markets. But before I do so, I should probably, in the name of full disclosure, since I will be making some remarks about the economy, reveal to you a favorite saying of my grandfather. He founded our company back in 1917. He was an immigrant to the United States, came from Scotland, one of 10 children, grade school education, no money, but like millions who came here, he had dreams and ambitions and an opportunity to realize them. And when he started Forbes magazine, as you can imagine, people would ask him what's going to happen to the economy, what's going to happen to interest rates, what stocks should you buy or sell, and that kind of thing. And my grandfather, being an honest individual, would invariably reply, he would say, you make more money selling the advice than following it. So, full disclosure. Yes, these times, yeah, very litigious society. But, especially in this town, enough said. But concerning the economy, obviously there's a lot of anxiety out there, a lot of pessimism and concern out there, a lot of talk about the new normal, which is a euphemism for don't expect good times for a long time. But before I make remarks about the economy, let me just be a little simplistic for a few minutes and talk about, because I wrote a book about it, co-authored a book about free markets. Free markets right now are in bad odor. They're blamed for the disaster that we have seen. But I would posit that this disaster that we are trying to get out of was not a result of some fundamental flaw with free markets, but actually the result of several massive policy errors. And that, in one sense, should be discouraging that we could make such big mistakes, but also, in a sense, should be encouraging, meaning that if we get things right, do a few things right principles, right policies, there's no reason why, very quickly, we can't get back on track again. As a matter of fact, I think it's good to put in perspective, since we are in the doldrums right now, that between the early 1980s and the summer of 2007, when this crisis first hit, we and the world went through one of the most extraordinary periods in human history. Never before had so many people in so many parts of the world advanced so quickly economically as happened in that quarter of a century. The United States obviously did well. Our share of the global GDP from the early 80s to the early part of the last decade actually inched up a little bit. Even more impressive was our share of the global equity market in terms of valuations. That went up even more. But we all know that the rest of the world did extraordinarily well, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. India, China, literally millions and millions of people each year joining the middle class. But you take Central and Eastern Europe, that region as a whole had higher growth rates than the Asian region as a whole. Numerous countries in Africa, over a dozen, got no publicity, were starting to really rise up. Latin America, while people focused on troubling-making countries like Venezuela, others were starting to emerge, like Colombia. So that, of course, raises the question, what in the world went wrong? But before getting to that, let me just make some simplistic observations about free markets, because I think that it's very, very easy at a time like this to overlook them. Capitalism, which is a word in even more ill repute than free markets, which my lack of marketing sense is why I put the title on the book, just why I'm speaking here instead of retiring on my 401k. But capitalism is a moral system. It has been the best poverty fighter in human history, the best system that allows for innovation and invention and creativity. And the system works this way, very, very basic. In true free markets, you succeed only by providing a product or service that somebody else wants. So we have this cliche, you see it in the popular novels, you see it in Hollywood, that always portrays the heavies as business people, especially the heavier the better. And so it's almost cliche to have the business person either shriveled up but taking great glee in the suffering of others, plotting to ruin the world, or jowls bouncing about as they figure out how to pollute water, kill your pets and everything else. And yet, even if you are that cliche, even if you lust for money, you don't get it in a free market unless you provide something that somebody else wants. It forces you to pay attention to the needs and wants of other people. That's what free markets are about, serving the needs and wants of other people. And if you don't provide that product or service, you fail, unless you can get this town or a state capital to bail you out. You don't succeed. And our founders, the founders of this country, understood that we are endowed with energies and ambitions. And part of their task was, how do you provide an environment, a society, where those ambitions are channeled in a constructive direction? For a long time, it was thought that if you wanted to get something, you had to take it from somebody else, sort of a zero-sum mentality. But especially Franklin and Hamilton understood that if you provide the right environment, your success can be other people's success. And in terms of the ambition to get ahead, that's not greed. If you have certain talents, you should have a society that will enable you to realize and develop those talents to the fullest. That's not immoral. That's almost a duty if you have those kinds of talents to develop them. You get ahead, but others get ahead. Adam Smith explained about getting dinner. Capitalism means transactions, not looting or polluting. It means transactions. You want something, somebody else wants something. We're about to have dinner. You go to a restaurant, you want the food, restaurant wants your money, they give you the food, you give them the money. Both get something out of a transaction. Now, human nature being what it is, there's certain transactions that really bug us. Paying electricity bills, real pain in the neck. No fun in that. That's not like shopping. You have to do it. Or paying the rent. Again, doing something, you don't like to do it, you always hate the landlord. But again, even though you may not like to have to do it, you may not like what they charge, you each get something out of the transaction. Now, human nature being what it is, even though we bellyache about paying extra for electricity, many people don't hesitate to then go out and lay out $150, $200 for a pair of blue jeans that look like they came out of a dumpster. But go figure. But that's the way the system works. And what it does, it creates ever more complex circles of cooperation. I mentioned the restaurant. If you're a restaurateur, you assume farmers and others grow the food. People will process the food. People will deliver the food. Companies will make your stoves, your refrigerators, your utensils, your furniture, and everything else, provide you the electricity. These concentric webs of cooperation, and it works because no one is in charge. It happens, meeting the needs and wants of others. We don't think about it. And part of the problem with understanding free markets is we're like fish in water. Fish do not know they're swimming in water until you pull them out. But in the system itself, we just sort of take it for granted, which is why we then end up doing things, not understanding it, that either undermine it or develop huge amounts of mistrust. So it also develops trust. I don't mean naive trust, but in this ability to develop cooperation, it breaks down age-old barriers on family, ethnic groups, tribal groups. We take it for granted in this country. You want to start a business, you go out and hire people. But in other countries, very tough to go beyond the immediate family for any kind of position of responsibility. Go beyond immediately tribe or ethnic group in terms of a business. But in a true free society, those barriers are broken down, perhaps not socially, but in terms of cooperation, yes, they do break down. Just give you one example. It's not an iron law, But you look at Ireland, Northern Ireland, 300 years, Catholics and Protestants blowing each other up. Now they've come to a tenuous peace. It wasn't just great diplomacy that brought that about. The huge catalyst was the boom in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. Huge boom. Now they're in a recession now, but they'll climb out of it. But that boom that started in the early 1980s, massive amounts of foreign investment, which they welcome, giving out tax holidays, slashing business taxes to get those jobs in. When that boom began and really started to develop, that got across to the north. Something was happening there. And so these age-old stagnation of just being in a rut of hating one another, well, they may still hate one another, but I think it was P.J. O'Rourke humorously described how in Northern Ireland they still hate one another, Catholic, Protestant, but they're just too busy to blow each other up. You know, you have your to-do list. You know, you got to take the kids, pay the mortgage, soccer match, just can't get around to blowing up my neighbor. You know, just too many other things to do. Well, humorous, but making a point. Now, as I say, it's not ironclad. Europe, World War I shows that things can break down, even though you have more and more international cooperation. But human nature being what it is the best way to develop new forces, new middle classes, new outlooks, new priorities. So, creativity, all kinds of creativity. No matter what your background, you can create. And even in age-old things, for example, clothing. Clothing's been around since cave days. You know, in those days, I don't know whether woolly mammoth skins or bear skins or whatever you wore, but it's been around for thousands and thousands of years, yet people still find creative ways. Several years ago, for example, a kid in high school, football player, noticed that during workouts, especially in late summer, early autumn, you sweat. Go through a lot of t-shirts. And he figured out why. So in college, same thing, sweat a lot. So he figured, can't we invent something that absorbs the sweat? Apparently it hadn't occurred to anyone or did anything about it. So this kid researcher, in college, football player, goes and does research, stumbles across a certain fabric in medicine that's used to absorb moisture after certain kinds of procedures, and figures, isn't there a wider application for this? He pushed it, eventually went to a tailor as he made his advances, made up about 6 or 8 prototype t-shirts, went to his teammates and said, try it out. They first resisted because it felt kind of silky, sissy. We're football, not sissy stuff. Well, he got them to try it out, and it worked. The fellow's name is Kevin Plank, Under Armour. And truly, he lives up to the socialist communist myth. He really makes his money off the sweat of other people. But this kind of thing happens all the time, and you see it. You know, we're used to biotechnology and high technology, but you go to a coffee place, go to Starbucks, you notice something. The lids are the same size, whether they're 12 ounces, 16 ounces, 20 ounces. Fast foods haven't quite mastered it yet. Coffee houses have. But think of what that does, that little thing, in terms of saving on inventory, saving on figuring out how much of this, how much of that. That kind of thing goes on all the time. And so the true capital, again, being simplistic, but it gets overlooked, true capital is what you're developing, the human mind, the brain. There's no such thing as natural resources. Take, for example, oil. We think of that now. Natural resource can do some unnatural things when it gets loose. But think of it. What is oil in and of itself? Just glop, gooey stuff. You can't eat it, you can't drink it, can't feed it to camels. Just goo. What made it something so essential that we develop sophisticated technology, drill all sorts of places, is human ingenuity that turned this glop into something that we now can't live without in terms of energy. Or you take microchips, sand, silicon, not about to run out of sand. And creativity means also not just coming up with something all brand new, but taking ideas, failures of the past, technologies. Take the iPod. That's what the Walkman should have evolved into, but didn't. He took Steve Jobs also, the failures from the Newton, and eventually came up with the iPod, transformed Apple, made it a major factor again. So creativity, and it's not enough to invent. The key is innovation. Innovation means taking invention and applying it and continually to refine it and improve it. China invents paper. China invents the compass. But because it did not have that open society, you see this kind of creativity in other societies in the past, like Alexandria from 350 BC to 200 BC. Societies go through creative periods, but because they don't have this open free market, don't have the institutions to support it, it withers away. So these inventions really become curiosities. Whereas in an open society, they become applications you can't even imagine. Take the internet. Came out of DARPA, the Defense Department, communication between universities. Throw out on the open marketplace, turning everything upside down, including my own business, media business. See it happen all the time. Take one of the great inventions of World War II, the mainframe computer, originally designed, invented to help quickly calculate where artillery shells go. Obviously, artillery shells, there's more to mainframe computers than artillery shells. But again, in terms of innovation means who learns to apply this stuff? If you ask who made the most money from mainframes, it wasn't IBM's competitors. Most of those went by the wayside. IBM itself, 20 years ago, nearly went broke, was rescued, now a mighty company again. But you know who made the most money from mainframe computers? Sam Walton, Walmart. Early 1960s, small Northwest Arkansas retailer. At the time, Kmart 50 times the size of Walmart. Walton figured out that if he managed inventories and then supply chains by using computers, obviously devising special software, get intelligence better than anyone else, he could beat the giants at his own game in a business. Retailing's been around forever. He did it. And by the way, one of the things he did, and this is part of creativity, is how to manage inventories. One of the things he did, which didn't occur to many other entrepreneurs, Berlin Airlift, 1948. Russians cut it off. How do you supply a city from the air? Never been done before. Huge logistical feat. He studied those things to figure out how you apply that emergency response to the commercial sector. So that kind of thing goes on all the time. And so in terms of when people worry about the rise of China and other countries, the key thing for those countries in the future, can they create a society where instead of taking what's out there and refining it, they can create afresh, where people can come from the most unlikely backgrounds, have an environment where failure is not considered a stigma, where they can create, because most new things do not work. But if you don't have that kind of openness and tolerance of the messiness of creation, you can have all the government policies you want. It's not going to put you where the United States is today, and that's something we tend to overlook here. So in terms of getting ahead, in terms of specialization, specialization is good. It allows you to develop talents that might have lain dormant before. Just to make that point simplistically, take, for example, Michael Jordan, greatest basketball player ever. Now, if you didn't have specialization, where you had more and more sports, Michael Jordan might have ended up playing baseball. He tried it, failed, never could get above AA, and that was a stretch. But basketball, by golly, we all know what happened. And it also teaches free markets, teaches people to work with one another, teaches them the habits, to learn to be productive. What's one of the greatest job training programs in the country? You know what it is, McDonald's, or other places where you work part-time. It's not so much the money you make there, but you learn, show up on time, learn to make a product, learn to work with others, tolerate others, learn you got to service customers. Things we take for granted, like walking. If you can't do it, it's a miracle. But once you do it, it's second nature. So that's what free markets do, breeds cooperation and the like. Now, what about the underside of business or anything else? James Madison, father of the U.S. Constitution, was exactly right. He said if we were angels, we would not need laws, we would not need government. Well, we're manifestly not angels, unless it's grandchildren, up to a certain age. And so, in terms of human nature, that has not changed. It's not going to change. And you're always going to get people pushing things, doing things they shouldn't do, no matter what the walk of life. But just because, for example, we have fraud in elections doesn't mean we get rid of democracy. You try to root out the fraud, what perpetrated the fraud. You try to put in rules of the road. And so, Accidents, what happened with BP? I think when the examinations are finally done, it'll be what will have turned out to have happened was that certain procedures should have been followed, weren't followed. What they call in the airline industry, pilot error. And that's why pilots, when you go on the airplane, you see them talking to each other on a checklist. No matter how experienced you are, you must go through that checklist, because one of the things is when things get in your habit, you start to get sloppy. That's what happened, I think, with this platform. Procedures that should have been followed weren't followed. And so those checklists you see with the pilots on the commercial airlines, no matter how many years of experience, it's absolutely to prevent you from getting that frame of mind. It's never gone wrong before. That's precisely what happens when you get that attitude. Things happen that seem absolutely inexplicable. So in terms of the role of government, government, of course, has a role, as Madison said, everything from security, from enemies on the outside, law and order on the inside, safety, rules of the road and the like, safety nets, dealing with disasters, infrastructure, special projects, whether it's Lewis and Clark or mapping unexplored territories and the like, basic research. Government has roles there. It also has two other key roles. One is responding to change. One thing you get with free markets is you constantly get change and you have to revise the rules of the road. Mention the automobile. Well, you have to have speed limits. You have to have rules on you turn your indicator on. Basic stuff like that. Or Xerox, 45 years ago, invents the copier. That means you got to amend copyright law, fair use doctrine. We're grappling today with all the things the web is doing in terms of distributing music, distributing video. You have to revise the rules of the road. And one of the failures in recent years was the failure of government to revise the rules of the road with financial innovations. You take derivatives. Derivatives are simply a fancy word for what we've had forever. Soybean futures, interest rate futures. So much more sophisticated, can have real ramifications, but there's no reason why you can't have clearinghouses, margin requirements for them like you have for everything else, like the SUV. SUV really is kind of a hybrid. It's not quite a truck, although it may be classified as a light truck, not quite your traditional car or van, but it doesn't mean you don't have speed limits for it just because it's a new kind of vehicle. So keeping the rules of the road up to date. But also government has a role in making sure you create an environment, and this is where we're falling down here and elsewhere around the world right now, creating an environment where free markets can flourish. Let me give you 5 basic principles of economic growth. They'll sound, again, very simplistic, but it's amazing how often they're overlooked. One, of course, is the rule of law. Rule of law means individual equality before the law. If the individual is not protected, existing power structures will crush the entrepreneur. In many countries today, you're an entrepreneur, you challenge politically connected people, you are in big trouble. Also means boring things like property rights. We take it for granted here. You buy an apartment in this town, you can go to a bank in Texas, Tokyo, London, get financing for it if they're in the mood to finance these days. Property rights, uniform system. We take it for granted. Most countries, many countries, do not have a uniform property system. Several years ago, for example, Egypt, the president of Egypt, Mubarak, called in a group of economists, at the behest of his son, to do a census. Who owns the businesses in Egypt? Who owns the housing in Egypt? So it was headed by a Peruvian economist. They go out, do the survey, came back and gave the report to the president, said, Mr. President, do you realize that 88% of your businesses are illegal? Well, turns out you had to go through at least a dozen different procedures. Very expensive. Who knows what you had to give to get the license process going, moving. So guess what? Most of the economy is informal. Remember the Prime Minister of Bulgaria years ago was shocked to find you had to go through 17 different procedures, steps to get a license. In this country, we take it for granted. You go through a formality, it's a matter of days or weeks. New Zealand will do it in 24 hours. Doesn't mean you're going to succeed, but it's a formality to set up a legal business. So then they asked the president, what about housing? They said 92% of your housing is illegal, including your public housing. He said, what do you mean? They showed him pictures of Nasser City. They said, Mr. President, when this stuff was built, 2 stories tall. Look at it now, 4 stories, 6 stories. People just built on top of it. They found there's no uniform property system, 8 different property systems. What that means is you can't turn a structure into capital. In this country, before we went on this mortgage binge, biggest source of capital for new businesses was mortgages. Increasing your mortgage or a second mortgage to get money to start a business. So Hernando de Soto, Peruvian economist, figures, we worked with him on this, around the world there are 4 billion people with assets worth $9 trillion that is dead capital, precisely because there's no uniform property system to turn just something habitable into also a source of capital. One of the biggest things that happened in Japan after World War II, which had a medieval property system before the war, was after the war, the Americans came in and did a survey, and Japanese, turns out the small farmers had an informal system, although they didn't own the land, they had an informal system of who, in their eyes, owned what. They didn't really own it, it was owned by others, but who, in their eyes, owned the thing. So what, in effect, the American occupiers did was take this informal system and formalize it. You now had a legal system. Huge, underestimated factor in Japan's post-war miracle. So boring things like the rule of law, enforcement of contracts. As a matter of fact, if you ever get insomnia, if I haven't done it, cured it now, all you have to do is go online to the World Bank. They put out a survey. They put out a survey each year called Doing Business. Survey of 183 economies around the world, all on boring stuff like enforcement of contracts, property rights, and stuff like that. Heritage Foundation and others do the same thing, freedom indices. It's amazing what you think in terms of things we take for granted in advanced societies. And no coincidence, those who do worse than these boring things are the poorest countries, because it's not a lack of entrepreneurial energy. You go to Africa, plenty of energy there, but they don't have the system and structure that allows that energy to develop real sustainable growth. So rule of law. Another one, of course, is sensible taxes. One thing that this town and many others don't get is that taxes just don't raise revenue. Taxes are also a price. Think of it this way. Tax on income, price you pay for working. Tax on profits, price you pay for being successful. Tax on capital gains, the price you pay for taking risks that work out. The idea is a very simple one. Lower the price of good things like productive work, risk-taking, success. You get more of those good things. Raise the price, you'll get less of those good things. So, paradox. The worst thing we can do now, which we're going to ignore, is to raise tax rates in the name of solving deficits. What that does is it hurts future growth, which hurts future revenue, but also hurts asset values, because you have a slower economy, less valuable the assets in that economy. So, third one, absolutely boring, money, stable money. Federal Reserve, interest rates. I can see the eyelids even getting heavier now. There is no more boring subject than monetary policy or the need for stable money. So let me give you a couple of tips, just so your time has not been totally wasted here. And that is, if you ever find yourself in coach, in an airplane, in a middle seat, on the runway, watching your life pass away, talk to your seatmates about monetary policy. You'll have all the room you want. Or if any of you are single, on a bad date, want out, talk about monetary policy and you'll never see that person again. Guaranteed. But think of it as you would this way. Think of it as you would an automobile. You could have a magnificent vehicle, great vehicle, but if you don't have sufficient fuel or juice, stall. Too much, flood the engine, burn it out. The right amount, you have a chance to move ahead. Same is true of monetary policy. You can have an economy with basic strengths, but if you don't supply it with enough liquidity, you're going to stall it. Too much, you get the economic equivalent of flooding the engine. Right amount, you have a chance to move ahead. So stable money. One of the things that's not understood in this very sophisticated age, what is money? money, among other things, simply facilitates transactions. Think of it, in the old days it was barter, very cumbersome, made it very hard. Imagine, if I sold a subscription in the old days, I'd get goat cheese, sheep, somebody's shoe, or, figure out how do I, now I've got to figure out where to take the shoes to pay my step. I mean, no, it just makes it easier, money. But what that means is people create money by creating products and services. And cash, electronic blips, coins are simply ways of making these transactions infinitely more complex, which means infinitely more prosperity. Now, gold and silver, the reason that was important once upon a time was very simple. It had intrinsic value, which meant you could use it as money across village borders, across empire borders. Now, why did Athens rise up? Lydia, next door, started to use coins for transactions. That's what made Athens, enabled Athens to become a great cultural center, easing of those transactions. And I always say today we have credit cards, blips, and everything else. But it's all to facilitate. So money should be stable in value. It comes from what people produce. So the idea that if we gin up and print money, we'll create prosperity. No, you just muck things up. Think of it this way. Now, I know the Fed's around here, but I'll tell you what I think of them. But think of what would happen, what your life would be like if we decided to do to clocks and watches, timepieces, what we do to money. 60 minutes an hour one day, 72 minutes the next, 36 the next, 19 the next. You'd soon have to have hedges, derivatives, futures, figure out how many hours you're going to work. Make it simple. Make it simple, then you can focus on real things instead of trying to figure out what's the price of oil today. We know the dollar price, but how much of that is inflationary anticipation? Too much liquidity out there because you have an uncertain monetary value of the currency. Why, that means that people are making commodities investment classes. Crazy. No. Bad. Well, we did it in the 70s, but that was a long time ago. Might as well have been the Pleistocene age as far as the policymakers are concerned. So, stable money. So, rule of law, sensible tax rates, simple one, the simpler the better. Sound money. Another one, of course, is make it easy to set up businesses. It relates to, obviously, the rule of law. And finally, removing barriers, whether they're trade barriers or internal barriers. You look around in any country, you'll find internal cartels, licensing procedures. Now, everyone knows the importance of licensing physicians and pilots and the like, but Pennsylvania, they'll arrest you if you try to braid hair, unless you take a 2-year course in chemistry or something. Ridiculous. It's just barriers to entry. And so you look at Greece in the headlines now. We have Greases here. They're called California and others. Greece. One of the problems in Greece is internal barriers. Huge cartels inside in terms of barriers of entry to professions. Very hard to set up a legal business in Greece. So in addition to telling the Greeks, tighten your belt, create conditions where entrepreneurs can flourish. Can Greeks flourish? Well, they come to this country, do very nicely, thank you very much. But in Greece, they're suffocated, so they all work for the government. And we know where that leads. Shouldn't say that here, but I can. But seriously, 5 basic principles. And if government fosters those principles, rule of law, like the sanctity of contracts, sound money, sensible tax system, make it formality to go into a business, remove artificial barriers to business, society will flourish. And if you have sensible rules of the road, now this gets to, okay, if all this is so great, why the heck did we have this disaster starting in 2007? If you look back at the thing, one of the chief perps for it is the Federal Reserve. Early part of the last decade, the Fed printed too much money, thought the American economy was weak, so it pumped out liquidity, kept interest rates at artificially low levels. Now, anytime you print, you couldn't have had a housing bubble unless the Fed provided the juice for it. Excess liquidity, and the European Central Bank and others tagged along, excess liquidity, bad things will happen. Should have learned that from the 70s. First thing that happens when you print too much money, where does it go first? Commodities. Why? Global. cash market denominated in dollars. Usually commodities are all over the place. Some are up in price, some are down in price, some tread water. When they all go in one direction, something is happening. So what happened in 2004? Oil went up, copper went up, gold went up, silver went up, soybeans went up, heck, even the price of mud went up. Everything went up. And people are wondering, what in the world is happening? Must be India and China. They're gobbling up all the world's resources. Or if you're a populist, those evil oil company executives, jowl bouncing away, manipulating markets. No, it was a classic commodities bubble. We had the same thing in the 70s. Oil went then from $3 to $40 a barrel, but it just doesn't stop with commodities, then flows into other areas. In the 70s, went into Iowa farmland, huge boom in farmland in the 70s when inflation was conquered, crashed in the 80s. You saw it in commercial real estate, saw it in energy. This time the big recipient in this country was housing. Housing was already booming in 2004 because of a tax law change we made in 1998. 1998, we lowered the capital gains tax on houses, virtually eliminated it. If you're a couple, sold your house, primary residence, first $500,000 free of tax. So if you look at housing prices pre-98, post-98 in the United States, you'll notice a difference. So by 2004, when this wave of liquidity was coming along, housing was already bursting. Then it went berserk, went on steroids. And people figured this is a no-lose proposition. Housing always goes up. It's written in the U.S. Constitution. Housing prices must go up each year. So the lending standards went down. They invented a new mortgage. The new mortgage was, why have an income? Who needs it? Even if a borrower defaulted, it didn't matter. The asset was always going to go up. So heck, you could have gotten your dog a mortgage if you wanted. The doghouse, 3,000 square feet. People didn't care. And then it was, I know I shouldn't say in this town, but then it was made even worse by Fannie and Freddie. Implicit guarantee of the U.S. government, $1.5 trillion of subprime suspect paper, guaranteed by the end of 2007. Bubbles, they burst. This one burst. Then it was made worse by another utterly boring subject, and that is accounting. This is what nearly destroyed the system in the autumn of 2008, and it may come back again. This gets to, how do you value, for regulatory purposes, the capital of banks and insurance companies and other financial institutions? How do you value it? For capital, for regulatory purposes, for decades, the rule was book value. What you paid for it is what it stayed on the books. So if you bought a $1,000 bond, it stayed on the books at $1,000 for regulatory capital purposes unless you either sold it or it became impaired. Something went wrong. Otherwise, it stayed at $1,000. Capital is supposed to be counter-cyclical. It's supposed to keep you down when times get giddy, and it's supposed to provide a cushion when times get bad. It's supposed to be ballast. What this thing called mark-to-market did, if you ever hear mark-to-market accounting, just train yourself like a Pavlov dog. Boo, hiss, bad. What they did in 2007, and this idea had been perking around since the early 90s, was they brought in mark-to-market accounting for securities, which meant that in a down market, you just didn't write off your bad paper. You had to write down the value of your good paper, even though the cash flows were perfectly good. You had to write it down in value. So it'd be the equivalent of if you were told, sell your house or sell your car in the next 2 hours, you'd say, that's ridiculous, that's stupid, it's can't get anything for it in that kind of time period. Well, that's in effect what they did. So if you look at the losses of banks and insurance companies, you realize over $500 billion of those losses were not actual losses on bad paper, but book losses, artificial losses. So that's why the system was spinning down. It made it deeper and deeper. Now, mark-to-market had been banned in the Great Depression for a reason. It was banned because it was making a bad situation worse. But like monsters in movies, bad ideas keep coming back. This one was banned in 1938. By 2007, it was enshrined by the Financial Accounting Standards Board, just in time for the disaster. So the system was spinning out of control, downwards. If we'd done that 20 years ago, none of you are old enough to remember the 80s. It's called pandering. I tried it in politics, didn't work, which is why I'm here, not at my library. But yeah, midlife career change, all that kind of stuff. But in the 80s, we had a severe banking crisis. Remember S&Ls and things like that. If we had a mark-to-market then, we'd have destroyed every top commercial bank in this country. At the time, banks were loaded with Latin American debt, equivalent to 260% of their capital. If you just applied it to that debt, which was then selling in the open market about 10 cents on the dollar, because people figured those countries were going down the tubes, you've destroyed the 8 top commercial banks in this country. We didn't do it. But this time we did. Now what happened was, in March of 2009, the rule was at least amended. You know why it was amended? Not because of the Fed or Treasury or FASB or the SEC or the White House, but because of the US Congress. I know, it's shocking for somebody like me to say something nice about Congress, but occasionally something good comes out of it. In March of 2009, for its own reasons, House decides to hold hearings on mark-to-market accounting, making it very clear they wanted a change, like right now. When that announcement was made, was the very day the stock market turned around from its lows. Markets anticipate the future. And so the hearings were held a few days later. They brought in representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, just beat their brains out. Not physically, but Congress loves to verbally slap people around. So they really slapped these people around. Market went up even more. 3 weeks later, the rule was amended. I wish they had abolished it, but they at least amended it. That's when the market turned. The system started to come back to life. Remember 2 years ago, all the talk about what do we do about the bank's toxic assets? That's why we need TARP and all that stuff. As soon as you took away mark-to-market, institutions, for the most part, could deal with the bad assets because they knew they weren't going to have to take unnecessary losses on their good assets. But FASB's back again. They want to now apply mark-to-market to all loans. Which, why? Well, one, it protects you from lawsuits. Oh, the market told me to do that. The other is it's great for business. You know, it's, you'll have to hire 500,000 more accountants. Great. Charge enough for that. But watch for that. So the system started to come back. Okay, where does that leave us today? Right now, the U.S. economy is growing. Not as much as it should, because we're not following those basic principles. And this shouldn't be partisan. In terms of the value of money, John Kennedy, Democrat, dollar should be as good as gold. Ronald Reagan, with Volcker, killed the terrible inflation of the 70s. Bill Clinton, for crying out loud, understood just for political reasons. You don't want a weak dollar. He realized, he looked no dope. He looked at Carter. Look what happened to that administration. Wasn't going to allow that to happen in his watch, even though he had to do things he did not want to do. He knew weak money, political poison. Previous administration, Republican, went for a weak dollar. So far, this administration's continued it. So this shouldn't be partisan. Sound money should be bipartisan, nonpartisan. So, thing to look out for, watch what happens to the dollar. Don't look at it vis-a-vis the euro. That's like comparing a 98-pound weakling with a 92-pound weakling. Neither one is going to be lifting weights in the Olympics. All you have to do is look at the price of gold. For years, average price, $335 to $350 an ounce. Now it's over $1,200. That tells you all you need to know. Key for the Fed to change, for Treasury to change. Stable money. Good thing. Otherwise, you hurt investment, you encourage speculation, you get weird allocations of capital. Very, very important. Watch what happens on the tax battle. They're now about to pass a bill that's going to trash S-corps. Any of you know about S-corps, small businesses? If you're a professional, they're about to rip you apart just to raise some quick cash. So watch what happens on the tax front. Be aware of that. Watch what happens on the front of trade. And let me just close, if we get the Q&A, talking about free markets, key thing on health. Ask ourselves, since I'm here at Johns Hopkins, not at the big one, but hey, why do we have a health care crisis? Think of it. The ready answer is, well, we want more health care. We're living longer. Well, as I get older, I don't think longevity is a crisis. My heirs might, but I kind of like it. But ask yourself, in any other part of an economy, if people want more of something, it's seen as a great opportunity. People want more superb education. Dr. Gupta will be very happy. He will supply it. People want more software. Austin, Silicon Valley, Northern Virginia will supply it. People want more cars. Detroit would be very happy to supply them. So what's with health care? The answer is we don't have real free markets in health care. We have pockets of it. Well, it's a crazy hybrid system, like a pretzel going on steroids. You don't really have it. You have a disconnect between providers and consumers. It's all third party, whether it's insurance companies, employers, government. Think of it. If you go to a doctor, clinic, or hospital and ask what it's going to cost, they look at you. Either that means you're uninsured or you're just a lunatic. Why else would you want to know what it costs? What's it to you? It's the insurers, the employer. Fill out the paper. Imagine going to a restaurant and say, oh, just, it's under the insurance. I don't care. Because we grow up with it, we don't realize how weird that system is all around the world. And so as a result, you don't get the kind of innovation, constant productivity that you get elsewhere. And so the system goes haywire. And so it becomes unsustainable, absolutely unaffordable. If you look at those crazy unfunded liabilities with Medicaid and Medicare, that assumes very little productivity in medicine. You get real productivity and those liability numbers come crashing down. And so can you get productivity in healthcare? Yes, you can. Just give you a few examples. Contact lenses, cheap, a few bucks now at Walmart. They're a fraction of what they cost 20 or 30 years ago. But because you lay out the cash, providers have every incentive to make it more affordable and attractive to you. LASIK surgery for the eyes, the same thing, down a third in real terms. Cosmetic surgery, none of you need it. Yeah, some habits die hard. But in terms of cosmetic surgery, in the US, cosmetic surgery has increased sixfold in the last 15 years. And you had major technological advances, yet you haven't had the kind of crazy inflation there you had in the rest of healthcare. Why? Unless it's a result of disease or accident, providers know you're making the decision. So if you want something done, what do? You scope it out like you do with anything else. If you have friends who can keep their mouth shut, you'll ask them. Yes. And so it works. It works. So why can't we do in healthcare for something like we do even more basic than healthcare, which is food? No food, no health. Because people may have difficulty in getting food, we have everything from food stamps to food banks to deal with it, but that doesn't mean the government has to run farms. If government did, we wouldn't have an obesity problem. There'd be no food. We would all be very thin. Russians and Chinese tried it. It does not work. So we allow farmers to grow the food, private companies to process the food, companies to ship the food, restaurants, supermarkets, grocery stores, hotels, and others sell the food. People can't get it, you deal with it. Why can't we do the same thing in healthcare? Get more free enterprise. Get more of the Kevin Plank's and Steve Jobs kind of mentality in terms of driving productivity in healthcare. Can it be done? Yes. Variety of things. Nationwide competition in health insurance. I live in New Jersey. We have crazy regulations. I can buy a policy half the price in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Illegal. I can buy a car in Pennsylvania, can't buy the insurance. Open a bank account, can't buy the insurance. Nuts. Have nationwide competition, shopping in health insurance. Equal tax treatment. You're an individual, not self-employed. You have to use after-tax dollars if you want to buy the insurance. As a business, get a tax deduction. Well, it already puts you as an individual at a 40% disadvantage. Make it equal. Tort reform. Or how about making it easier for individuals to pool together? You're in a fraternal association, sorority, or whatever, bowling league or whatever, church group, synagogue group or whatever, trade association for small businesses. Why can't you pool together like you do with affinity credit cards? Buy health insurance, get the volumes to get a lower price. Those kind of basic things. Remove barriers to health savings accounts. So you do those things, you start to get real free enterprise, and you focus. Whatever reason somebody can't get something, you deal with it like you do with food. And that way, you turn what looks like a hopeless liability into one of the greatest growth industries ever, because why? Healthcare is personal. We will take a keen interest in it. But I'm wearing a brace. If I was on Medicare, I've got a few more years before I go on that, but if I was on that, this would probably cost anywhere from $200 to $300. Just throw it in, even though on the internet you can get it for $47. So when it's your money that's at stake, you'll get value for it. That's what things like health savings accounts. You can have catastrophic insurance, then at a very cheap, affordable price, so you don't get ruined if you have a major accident or something goes wrong. So bottom line, right now, we still haven't fully gotten out of this recession. We are growing. Inventories are being rebuilt. Companies are spending again on capital expenditures just to keep themselves competitive. Consumers are spending a little more. So we will get 3-4% real growth rates this year. The question is, how sustainable will it be? But if we do get back on track, sound money, sensible taxes, realize free markets with sensible rules of the road work. Again, you don't drive 90 miles an hour in a school zone. You don't drive when you're drunk. But that doesn't mean government should tell you what to buy, where to buy, or where to drive, what to drive, when to drive. So sensible rules of the road, whether it's derivatives or anything else. Free markets, as much as imperfect people can, it will work. You'll get the Kevin Plancks to be figuring out ways, whether it's coffee lids or sweat or healthcare or anything else, to make our lives richer. And as Abraham Lincoln put it, give us the opportunity to improve our lot in life. Thank you. Thank you. The question is, why has gold in the last 2 years gone up more than other commodities? Even though they all go in one direction, usually they don't all have the same magnitude at the same time. What you see in the price of gold is the anticipation that with this massive amount of liquidity out there, eventually it's going to come in and infect the system. And so, so I think that's part of it, because oil, the Chinese did anticipatory buying. Now they've pulled back from that, so oil prices have come down. But that's only temporary. If you don't curb the excess money creation, I guarantee you oil is going to go back up again. And if the Fed gets its act together, I would think you're going to see gold quickly go down $300 or $400 an ounce. There's a lot of anticipation that this thing, and especially now reinforced by what's happening in Europe, where they're responding the wrong way to the problems of Greece, making the same mistakes we are. They should push for austerity, but they also should push for at least short-term holders of Greek bonds take a little hit, so creditors know in the future you're not guaranteed if you buy this paper. So they will be more careful, which means Greece can't go on a spending binge because it's not going to be able to finance it in the markets. And also, though, you put in reforms that enable these countries to get back on their feet. I mentioned Ireland. Ireland was hit by this liquidity binge. Their property markets went berserk. They're now in a very severe recession. But one of the things the Irish did not do was give in to the pressures from the European Union and Brussels to raise their business tax, which is 12.5%. So I think Ireland, and plus they did their medicine, bitter medicine, a year ago. Unlike Greece, they didn't wait for a disaster to hit. before taking the tough medicine. So I think Ireland, if you're looking out, will do just fine. I'll give you another example. Lithuania. Cut back government spending, cut government salaries 20 to 30%, cut the prime minister's salary 45%, and they took the bitter medicine, but guess what's happening this year? They just cut their corporate tax rate from 20 to 15%. Unlike Greece, they're ready to move forward. Same thing with Estonia or Latvia, and so especially Estonia. And so, while we focus on Greece and Portugal and Spain, other countries have gotten it together. But the markets are haywire right now. But with gold, I think it's just real sheer anticipation. So it wouldn't take much to bring it sharply down if people were convinced the dollar was going to be stable again. But usually there's a very tight relation between oil and gold. Usually a ratio of about 12, 13 barrels to 1. An ounce of gold is usually worth 12 or 13 barrels. So right now, that would mean gold should be at about 900. So that means oil's been depressed because China's not anticipatory buying. Also means gold is very high because people just fear the worst. But it's temporary. And if you want to trade in that stuff, be very careful. They can bite you pretty quick. How does China measure up on the key success factors? One, they have a government that is determined to move ahead, so they will remove barriers to business. But they are still in the early stages of developing the rule of law, but it's beginning to happen. For example, in the coastal cities, people started to buy apartments, started to buy housing. Well, what does that mean? Can I pass it on to my heirs? So a couple of years ago, China had to pass got the old oligarchs in the Communist Party went berserk, property rights. First formation of property rights, not like we have here in the West, but starting to move in that direction. The currency, they got that right. We all worry about outsourcing to China. China outsourced its monetary policy to the Federal Reserve in the mid-1990s by fixing the renminbi to the dollar. And we thought that was outrageous. So they must wonder can't do anything right with these crazy people. But Hong Kong did it years before that, and we should have applauded it, because even if the Chinese mispriced the peg, the markets flush it out pretty quickly. So just to be simplistic again, if you sell a bottle of wine for the equivalent of 4 loaves of bread, and suddenly you notice you're only getting 2, you're going to adjust your price to get back to the 4. So China was not manipulating the currency. It tied it to the dollar. And that's why trade exploded between the two countries. Both exports and imports went up over 700%. And China became a center for supply chains. It wasn't that suddenly China became this Japanese-like powerhouse or German-like powerhouse in exports. Just a lot of stuff that was made in other countries assembled in China and then shipped to the U.S., so it got credit for the export, but a lot of other stuff was coming into China. That's why China's trade surplus with the rest of the world is a fraction of what it is with the U.S. That's why you got to be very, very careful on those trade numbers. First, they ignore capital flows, which are basic, but they ignore Intel having a facility in Malaysia that sells to Japan, ignores all those sorts of things. So you got to be very careful on those trade numbers. But so on the currency, the Chinese got it right. The regime preceding this one understood it very, very well. Now, in terms of what we should be focusing on with China is barriers to trade. There are a lot of barriers to trade in certain areas. That's what we should be focusing on. Forget the currency. We should be focusing on urging China to liberalize its capital markets. So it would be good for them, good for the world. Right now, you get money in China, where do you put it? You either put it in the stock market, so it goes, the market's going up and down like a roller coaster. You put it in property, so they're always trying to stamp out bubbles, recipient bubbles there, or in a virtually no interest savings accounts. Whereas if you had sophisticated markets like Germany has a surplus of the U.S., but it doesn't have burgeoning reserves. It goes all sorts of places. So if the Chinese were allowed, individual Chinese companies were allowed to bring money in and out, not have such severe capital restrictions, I think you'd see a much healthier flow of capital when we sell stuff to China. It would go in a variety of directions instead of just all going to the central bank. So they're partly way there, and one of the things they have to do is put in something like the flat tax. On paper, their tax rates are high, but like Italy and some others, the Chinese are very creative in finding ways of getting around it. And so I think that intellectual energy would be better used by just making it simple and lower the rate. And so they set up numerous little companies. They find all sorts of ways to dance around this thing. By the way, if you want to see that in microcosm, go to Taiwan. Or in the old days in Taiwan, they just loved to avoid taxes. It got so bad that when tax collectors would come to a store, knowing that the books were about as real as a piece of fiction, they would just look around the store, figure how much turnover they probably really had, give them a tax bill and say, if you don't like it, fight it in court. They didn't even bother to look at the books. They knew that was next. So and that's, Taiwan's very, very entrepreneurial. They're saying there is better to be a rooster than the tail of an ox. And so you see that on the mainland as well, very creative. So tax side, they should just formalize simplicity. So they got a ways to go, but they're moving there. But others have got to make, India's got to do more in terms of formalizing some of these things to really move to the next stage. Yeah. Well, the administration interfered with GM and Chrysler in the rule of law and shafted the creditors. That's something you'd expect from Argentina, not from the United States under Argentina under Juan Perón. Bad thing on mortgages. There are a lot of reforms in mortgages that need to be done, but the idea of cram downs has slowed the recovery in housing. And now in BP, why they want to take the law into their own hands and setting up a special fund, you don't have to. BP is not going to jump bail. It's got assets all over the U.S. For example, the huge oil pipeline in Alaska, worth billions, tens of billions. There's no way BP in the middle of the night can take that pipeline, 1,000 miles long, take it to London and hide it in a basement. It just not going to work. So instead of focusing on, we're going to force you to do this, force you to do that, BP knows, and the shareholders know, huge hit coming. And so instead they should focus on, and maybe they will when they make announcements tomorrow, is set up mechanisms for those who've been injured by the spill. So in an orderly way, you can quickly assess, and this is where they should bring in insurance assessors and others to figure out how do you do the complicated thing so people can get assistance quickly. And BP would know that that assistance would count against any future judgments against them. So it's done in an orderly way. And so you reduce fraud, you reduce lag times. You don't have the kind of chaos you had after Katrina. So that's what you'd be focusing on. Instead of like Congress is going to do, put $20 billion aside. Pick a number, $200 billion. Focus on getting the end result, which is relief for those who've been hurt. Because BP ain't going nowhere. In terms of, it's not something like you can send it off to Switzerland. No, the assets are here. In terms of the flat tax, yes, 25 countries have adopted it. Most of the Central and Eastern European countries have adopted it. One of the sensible things Putin did when he came into power a decade ago, Russia had a very convoluted and utterly corrupt tax systems, I should say, plural. They scrapped them all and put in a simple 13% flat tax. Within 2 years, collections doubled. The economy not only got better, but if you made it, you paid it. And it works. So 25 have done it. I think eventually, and by the way, Greece almost did one a few years ago, because in Greece, people don't pay taxes, which was the problem in Europe. Central and Eastern Europe, and so make this code simple. Make the rate low. Then it's very easy to collect the tax. So that's one of the things we should have urged the Greeks to do. Get that done, and you'll start to get real revenues instead of hiring more tax collectors and then go out on strike when you don't give them their 3-month bonus after 1 month of work. Get real on it. So I think we will in this country, just for the next 5 or 6 years, just for competitive reasons. Just to give you a couple of factoids. First, on the flat tax, it's a single rate. Generous exemptions for adults and for kids, but no other deductions. So if you're a family of 4, first $46,000 of income, free of federal income tax. Anything above that, 17% rate, proposal I had. And no tax on savings, no death taxes. I've always believed you should be allowed to leave the world unmolested by the IRS. Or as our founders would say, no taxation without respiration. And then the way you get it through, since people get hung up on their favorite tax credit, which we have about 10,000 now, or deduction or mortgage or whatever, is give people a choice. This would sort of be a variation of what Hong Kong does. And that is, when you bring in the new system, if people want to stay with the old, you let them. Let them see for themselves which one is better, so you don't get hung up on, oh, I might lose this. No, you'll be better off, but I don't believe it. Okay, do your own arithmetic, do your own calculations. So I think we will in the next 5 or 6 years, just because last year, for example, the IRS told us we spent the equivalent of 7.5 billion hours filling out tax forms, the equivalent of 3 million full-time jobs. It's crazy. There's no rhyme or reason for it. So I think eventually that's going to happen. Thank you.